Good evening, everyone. This is High Point Mayor Jay Wagner calling to order High Point City Council's special meeting for Tuesday, January 18th, 2022. Today, as of right now, here at City Hall, I'm present, as is Councilman Britt Moore, Mayor Pro Tem Monica Peters, Chris Williams, and Victor Jones. So we do have a quorum present and ready to proceed. And first, as others come in, I'll try to let you know. First on the agenda tonight is a presentation by our economic development folks about the downtown incentive policy and a modification to the office and industrial incentive policy. And I see that Sandy Dunback is already at the podium. So
yes, thank you,
turn the meeting over to
Mayor
Sandy.
And members of the council and staff. This is a request to consider adopting a new targeted downtown incentive policy and a modification to the office and industrial incentive policy. It would be funded by the city's Economic Development Incentive Fund, which is funded by general and electric revenues. The policy itself, this is the targeted downtown incentives policy, which is showing, and we are proposing that this would be in effect from its date of adoption until June the 30th of 2023. We had great success with our prior targeted downtown office policy, and we have had continued requests for potential incentives in the downtown. Council has invested heavily in the work of redeveloping our downtown and growing that investment and job creation, and we believe that these policies would continue to aid in that. So this would be to consider new and existing offices, other policies as well for retail, restaurants, or commercial developments. The previous policy allowed in rent assistance for up to 4 years in the amounts of 80, 60, 40, and 20% of rents. This proposal is to allow 45, 35, 25, and 15% of rents. So a lesser amount, but that we still feel would be able to make a difference to some of these projects. We have a number of investors that are creating brand new Class A office spaces in the downtown, and we have projects that are interested in coming into the downtown, but sometimes there is a gap in the project and what they are able to pay in terms of rents. They could also be eligible for the up to $3,000 per job in that area. Our longstanding job creation policy in other areas is up to $1,000 per job. We did pull out the upfit assistance that was up to $50,000 in upfit assistance in the downtown area. And that is the modification that has then gone into the other policy to allow for upfit building renovation assistance throughout the entire city, as we've had requests for that as well from other locations throughout the city, and we would believe that to be extremely helpful to those projects. This is the downtown MSD, which is the boundary for the rent assistance, and the $3,000 per position created. A project could singularly be eligible for the rent assistance or the job creation, depending upon the project and the scale and wages of that project. This is the modification of the office and industrial. If you see line item 2, it's an up to $75,000 building upfit grant, which could be authorized for office, industrial, or commercial buildings undergoing significant improvements, which increase the building's tax value by more than 25%. So they could receive an incentive of up to 50% of their total expenditures, not to exceed that $75,000, to make internal capital improvements for a better use for the building, a new use, or adaptive reuse of the structure. And again, we feel like with the age of many of our structures and High Point, people need assistance really in getting those buildings brought back up to kind of 21st century standards. So oftentimes, again, some level of assistance could be helpful to those projects. The state has the Building Reuse Grant Program, which we do encourage clients to take advantage of, but sometimes there would be factors that would not allow a company to be eligible for that state grant. So it'd be helpful to have our own local grant that would cover that. So those are the updates that I have for you today. Glad to answer any questions.
Anybody got questions? It's essentially just re-upping the incentive plan we had last year with some modifications. Not quite as generous.
It's on council's agenda for tonight.
Yeah, it is on the agenda. I believe it's part of the finance committee agenda for tonight. Any questions for Sandy? Thank you, staff and Sandy, for your hard work on this. I appreciate
Absolutely.
everything you've done. Okay, moving right along then. Next on the agenda is an update on minority and women-owned business enterprises, and I think Jelani Biggs is handling that, and Jelani is on remotely, I believe. We're working through some technical issues for those of you who are listening online.
Hello?
I heard you, Jelani.
Okay, I think I have some audio on my end now.
No problem.
Okay.
Go ahead, floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. I will share my screen. Mayor, let me know if you can see that.
You're good to go.
Yes, we can see
Okay.
it.
Perfect. Jelani Biggs, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer, here today to talk about the MWBE program development. As part of the previous DEI update given in December of last year, council requested that staff come back with additional information as it relates to expanding our MWBE program footprint. In gathering this information for you, a work group was established. It included Managing Director Jerron Hollis, Financial Services Director Bobby Fitzjohn, Assistant City Manager Eric Omedo, and myself. We'll jump right into the purpose. The purpose of a comprehensive MWBE program is to create a centralized and formalized process that connects underrepresented businesses with opportunities, resources, and technical assistance. Consistent with city policies and in accordance with state and federal laws, the overall goal is to increase the utilization of MWBE firms by the city and the market area. These are just a few key considerations. First, you want to be reviewing the current engagement efforts for MWBE firms. How do we go about emphasizing the use of these firms and when it may be appropriate to conduct a disparity study? Here you'll see some of our current practices. Right now within our financial services department, we do have staff that are handling some of these functions in addition to their primary duties, whether it's support of the Piedmont Triad Med Week. We're currently members of the North Carolina MWBE Coordinators Network. We have purchasing staff that's pursuing the Economic Inclusion Officer certification, which is managed by the UNC School of Government. That also includes attendance at meetings, trainings, and also annual conferences with that network. We're also collaborating with High Point Thrive Initiative. Most recently, in December of last year, staff conducted a lunch and learn, also developing outreach opportunities and building a database of MWBE vendors for departments to use. This is a continuation of some of those efforts. We're periodically updating the vendor portal to make it more user-friendly. This is a joint effort with Thrive High Point. We're tracking MWBE data for each bid and capture how a contractor performed at the close of a project. And a new email account has been established specifically for MWBE vendor outreach and keeping contact information up to date. These are just some policy highlights. Procedures for construction contracts aligns with the statutory goal of 10% participation by minority businesses in each construction project as mandated by the state. And procedures for purchasing and professional and personal service contracts. Currently, the city has not established numerical goals for contracting and utilizing MWBE businesses for purchasing professional and personal service contracts. If City Council pursues specific numerical goals or metrics, staff recommends conducting a disparity study. So then we want to explore what is a disparity study. It gathers evidence to determine whether the city has a strong basis for implementing race and sex-based preference contracting programs to remedy the effects of past or continued discrimination. Why is it necessary? A study will tell us where we stand. It'll evaluate current policies and practices. It also ensures that a program is tailored to our specific needs. And what would a disparity study provide us? What are some of the deliverables? To a certain degree, staff could determine the specific deliverables and scope of the study, but these are a few examples. It would quantify the disparity between availability and utilization of primes and subcontracts. It would also conduct a survey of business owners. It would provide us specific recommendations for our municipality, and it would also conduct a legal review, among other things. What is the cost? This is information that we gathered from an FAQ that was also provided to the City of Greensboro's City Council. $300,000 for the City of Greensboro. That was the cost of their study. And it included 2004 consultant man hours plus hours of work performed by sub-consultants. It included 1 year of post-study consultation to answer questions and provide guidance. And again, this would also be tailored to our municipality depending on the scope and scale of our study. But as you can see, we've also got some other municipalities included in this. $320,000 was budgeted for the City of Asheville and $345,000 for the City of Charlotte. This is just some other municipalities that have explored this. The City of Raleigh, from what I understand, is planning on conducting a disparity study this year. They, from what I can tell, have a robust outreach and vendor engagement program, even without having conducted a disparity study. But the list also includes municipalities that have already done so. These are just some structural examples. You'll see the city of Winston here, then another example after this. This is an example of a standalone department, the Office of Business Inclusion and Advancement. It has 4 FTEs, 4 full-time employees in it. It has 2 divisions, business development division and also an MWBE division. And then I've also included the city of Greensville, just another structural example. This one more closely aligns itself with our own financial services department. It's comprised of multiple divisions. We also have an MWBE coordinator embedded within the financial services division. And again, like I said, if we were to add an FTE here, it would more closely align with the city of Greensboro. One of the recommendations is to add a FTE or MWBE coordinator to kind of centralize and formalize that process for moving forward with vendor engagement. Also, if council chooses to move forward with a disparity study, they would also be the main point of contact for managing that process. And of course, DEI staff would help with some of the logistical support for vendor outreach and engagement. Some of the HUD certification trainings that you see with some of these programs, overview of forecasted city projects, and also any kind of mentoring program. We, as part of this process, met with Summit, Johnny Seegers, the director of their diversity and inclusion department there, and he talked about some of the vendor engagement and MWB outreach that they do on a regular basis and how that may be an opportunity for partnership as we expand our own programming. I'd be happy to entertain any questions you may have at this point.
This is Councilman Williams. I just got a couple of questions. Actually, one. Can you tell me, or is there any way that we could know what Asheville and Wilmington paid for their study? Because I think we're kind of somewhere in the middle when it comes to the population size between those two.
Sure, Councilmember Williams, and we can specifically look at those municipalities for that, and we can go back to that slide. The city of Asheville had budgeted $320,000 for their disparity study, and that's a range. Again, this would be a contract. We would engage with the consultant for specific deliverables, so that can range. But this is just meant to give you an idea of what that cost would be. And it's my understanding that every 5 years it would be expected that the city do a study every 5 years.
All right, thank you.
This is Councilman Moore. Jelani, when you, on this slide here, the city of Greensboro, when it's up, when was it instituted? You're looking at Asheville 16, Charlotte 17, whatever. Or have any of these turned in any results?
I'm not sure on the exact deliverables for the city of Greensboro. Again, Councilmember Moore, we can get back to you on that. It's my understanding that this was their most recent disparity study scope, which may have been within the last year or so. So that's a pretty accurate number, pretty recent number. But in terms of deliverables from that study, we'd have to follow up with them on that.
I'd be interested to know if anybody's got any results back. And also for staff, prior to this, I mean, MWBE is not new. We would get reports on targets that we've had. We would get information back on, you know, where we were or if we were short or getting close. But can someone speak to the efforts that were being made, say, prior 2020, 2019, and our policies and contracts and procedures?
Sure, and Councilmember Moore, I covered that briefly in some of the previous slides. What I would say, and I'll let financial services add some detail to this if they need to, is that right now we have staff within financial services. They're executing some of the functions that I mentioned earlier, whether that's some of the lunch and learn programs, whether that's some of the contractor follow-up on ensuring that they're meeting certain metrics and certain goals. but they're doing those in addition to their primary duties. If we want to expand on this program, it may be a discussion of additional staff resources within that department to expand that MWBE footprint and create a holistic program. However, I do think that that is distinct from what may need to happen in regards to a disparity study. There's vendor engagement and outreach, which we could do right now with additional staff support. A disparity study gives us a legally justifiable pathway to put some specific metrics and goals as it relates to purchasing and procurement, in addition to the state goal that we have for construction. So the study has a consideration in addition to the staff resources.
Okay, thank you. Jelani, when you're conducting a disparity study, how is disparity measured?
Well, I think what they're looking to see is identifying within your market area, based on the utilization that you currently have within your financial footprint, whether that's contracting with certain vendors, and seeing where you currently stand. From that, they'll make certain recommendations, certain determinations on how you can increase that. One of the first things that financial services cautioned was, if we're going to put specific metrics or numbers out there, it's best to do a disparity study first to avoid any kind of legal jeopardy as it relates to creating nuanced programs for underrepresented groups. So that's how I respond to that, Mayor.
So, like, let's take as an example, I mean, is disparity measured purely by percentage of population? Or let's say, if you're looking at plumbers or plumbing contractors, and you have 1,000 plumbing contractors, and of that, the percentage of female-owned business plumbing contractors is 7%, and the percentage of black-owned plumbing contractors is 5%, and Hispanic-owned plumbing contractors is 10%, then are we measuring against overall population or the percentage of the ownership by minority and women business enterprises to then determine whether our usage is actually a disparity? You
Mayor,
understand what
and
I'm
I can
saying?
give you more specific information on that, but I believe it's the latter. That when they come in and actually conduct a disparity study, they're looking at businesses and firms within your market area. Overall population may be part of that formula, but this specific exercise will be looking at the makeup of the firms within your area. What available firms are there that we're not tapping into?
Okay. Can we get, I'm sure staff has this somewhere, but can we get some historical data on our goals? I remember we looked at this the last time that was presented, and Eric is shaking his head. I think we did meet our goals last year, but maybe the year before we were a little under. So could we get maybe some historical data, maybe with a graph or something that staff could, or that council could look at to let us know? I know that there have been years when we haven't met our goal, but then there have been other years where we've exceeded it, sometimes by a lot. So I think that would be a good thing for us to look at and to make sure that we're, well, just to make sure this is not a solution in search of a problem, okay?
Mr. Mayor, this is Councilman Jefferson. So as I think about this conversation, and I appreciate the presentation from Mr. Biggs and staff, we as a council group, a little more than a year and a half ago, rolled out an initiative for diversity and inclusion. And it was in May 2020 that we mentioned a number of things that we believed as a council body and as a City of High Point organization we could do to promote diversity and inclusion. And in addition to trainings, in addition to hiring our first DEI officer and a number of other efforts, one of the things that was considered and actually included in that resolution, supported and endorsed by this entire body, was that we would consider if we needed NWBE, and if we needed to do something about our vendor diversity and supply chain. And in that time, and in the months to follow, we requested that staff share information with us. The staff, to your point, Mayor, has shared information about some of those results. And I was in the committee that heard these results, and then the committee that deliberated. And what was the consensus was that as a council group, we actually were not meeting the mark on where we need to be in terms of those goals. And when we attempted to look at the data disaggregated to see amongst those groups, disadvantaged groups, where it landed, we found that in terms of people of color, we were significantly below our goal. In terms of businesses owned by people with different abilities, we were significantly below our goal as well. And while we had great initiatives with Summit and others, there was still room for improvement. And that's why at the time we were discussing Disparity Study. We were considering partnering up with Deferred County, because at the time I think they were getting ready to do their Disparity Study, and there was the potential that we could have joined on to do theirs and had a cost savings anywhere from $60,000 or so to join in with that Disparity Study. It was determined at that time that council was not ready to hear that, despite having seen all the numbers and the metrics on that. I have that thought, and I want to go back to that in a second, but the other thought that comes to mind is that we're also simultaneously and subsequently having the conversation with regards to reparations, and it's a conversation for the One High Point Commission, and I know that Council Members Hudson and Council Member Holmes are representing this body as a part of those discussions, and that as a part of those discussions, they are looking, in fact, at disparities and inequities and things of that nature, and how we may make addresses to that. I think my point that brings me to this is that if we're going to ask staff to come back with more facts and figures about where we met, we are in fact going to be duplicating a conversation that we've already had once, if not twice. And at that point, what I would ask is if we're going to bring them back for that, I think it's got to be perhaps a little more intentional in terms of what our aim is with that. And I think it should be at that point to make a decision about whether or not we're going to do a disparity study. So what I would ask is that if we're asking staff to do that, then in that same meeting on the agenda will be a decision to vote on a disparity study or not. And I think that any other action is to be wholly duplicative and to not actually progress and move us as forward as we all agreed to do when we supported and endorsed the resolution in May 2020 to be a more diverse and inclusive city.
Councilman, if I may, Councilman Jefferson, following that, what are your measurements where is the point where we're at the diversity and inclusive numbers that you want to be? Or you see us that we should be to be our best?
So the point that I just stated, that I'll state again, we weren't meeting the percentage goals that we had set. We weren't meeting those goals. So in terms of my measurements are the measurements of this body and of this organization. We weren't meeting that. So, I mean, we can.
But if the mayor's comments were correct, then at some point years we were exceeding them and some we were not meeting them. Would you agree or not agree with that?
So I think, again, in terms of disaggregating it, we were looking at the various disadvantaged groups.
Okay.
While in women-owned businesses and vendors, we were certainly doing pretty well. We were, and if I could just use this term, pretty abysmal in terms of the other disadvantaged groups.
Sure.
And I mean, we were like 1 or 2%, and our goal was 10%. And it was one of those things where whether you're looking at the population of High Point or even the population of vendors,
okay.
I mean, if I had to eyeball just from the work that's done with Thrive High Point, I could tell you we're not meeting any one of those numbers comparably.
Well, I would, personally, for me, I speak for me, I'm 30 years down the road in front of you. I would caution this body in this city, which I think is exceptional, above Winston-Salem and Greensboro, that we probably have the intelligence
and the resources and the available knowledge right here without having to tag into Guilford County or having to tag into Greensboro or any other city. We tagged into Guilford County with the city schools 35 years ago, and a few other things. So I'm firmly confident in the people we have here, our ability to debate and discuss and analyze and get to where we want to get within our own resources right here.
I agree, and I appreciate that point. I think I raised the point about Guilford County in that if we wanted those cost savings.
You know me, I'm all for cost savings, but there's a long-term and a short-term to that process too, and a lot of that will play out after I'm gone from this body, so.
And it sounds like we agree that this body should be considering that, and I think my point is, again, if we're gonna ask staff to come back to share those numbers again, that it be for the purposes of taking action.
Question though, like if we are hitting our goals and percentages of MWBE participation, are we even legally allowed to differentiate a percentage has to be women versus a percentage has to be people of color, or is it just all looped in with one disadvantage?
Give that to our attorney.
I think, we've briefly discussed that before. There's a fine line of doing that, but of course, it's very important to take a look at where the city is and historically what we've been able to accomplish. Disparity study is definitely going to take care of that, to see whether or not there's room for more improvement and that sort of thing. But yes, you have to be very careful from a legal standpoint when you start dividing out protected classes, not just in this area.
Yeah, and I appreciate you bringing that point back up, and I appreciate the question. I think what Mr. Biggs also said very clearly, and you kind of just reiterated it, is that a disparity study allows us to learn where we have those disparities amongst those disadvantaged groups and see how it stacks up to give us the legal basis to do what you just said.
I have a question. So when, in some of those years that maybe we did not meet our goal, is there a way that staff can see, because not everyone that's going to put a bid in for a contract may not be qualified. So is there a way to see, like, well, if this year we didn't meet the goal because we hardly received any bids from women or minority businesses, is there a way to kind of...
Well, and if I could, as your city attorney, that's really what the city should have been doing all along. And
Okay.
I'm under the impression that they have been operating in that manner. One of the things that Councilmember Jefferson just said about setting ourselves up legally with this type of study and being able to divide those groups out, you're absolutely right. That really is the legal authority to be able to divide those groups out. If you come back with some evidence that there's been a wide range of disparity there, and we've come up short, if you will, it's almost like looking to see whether or not there's been any wrongdoing, whether it was, of course it would be purposeful, but the outcome of it. So it does give you the legal grounds, just as you just worded.
Thank you. And do you mind, and I'll be the first to say I'm probably a little more verbose on this topic just because it's certainly one that I've been passionate about. So I think your question is a good one, Councilwoman, Mayor Pro Tem Peters. I think for all of us here on the dais, everyone in the room, and for everyone listening, I think it's important that when we talk about people submitting proposals and wondering, well, if people aren't submitting proposals, then, perhaps the issue of participation is not in the hands of us if people are not proposing. The issue and history of our country has been predicated on that there for quite some time, because it negates that the issue and the history contributes to the lack of application on the part of proposers. So when we say, well, if folks are not taking advantage of this opportunity, then that means they don't want it. Well, if those folks, and speaking anecdotally here, don't feel and have historically been marginalized by an entity, then they're typically more apt to not fill out those things. And then there's other parts that the study, I think, if we're very clear about that study, to clarify, they're going to dig deep into why people aren't even submitting the proposals in the first place. Because I think we'll find there's a little bit more there to it, that there's again, there's just a history of our country, and we've seen it all the way up until, again, just about 18 months ago, where internationally we sort of saw the impact of racism. The history of our country is just set up where if someone's been doing business for 50 plus years as an entity that can beat out prices, it's not because that entity has been better for the past 50 years, it's because 50 years ago, a black or brown business didn't have the same opportunity to be as good as that white-owned business 50 years ago. And so part of it is a head start, part of it is an uneven playing field, and that's what I think a disparity study would probably allow us to understand and see a little bit more of.
And really, the disparity study is the legal grounds that would allow you to pursue that and to divide those out and to take a look at that, depending on what the results of the study would be. Legally, I would not recommend going forward with that division, et cetera, without the study, just as what's recommended by the department.
One final question about, to help me out, the world's moving at a fast pace. There's a lot of headline news every 15 minutes. What were you alluding to 18 months ago, Councilman?
So I'll mention the biggest event, which was the murder of George Floyd. What that did was it raised to the surface a lot of other conversations around inequities and disparities in business and in commerce and politics and other areas. And so it raised a national sort of conversation and conscience beyond sort of the murder of George Floyd. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me just possibly clarify what my earlier statement was. I'm not seeking another presentation by staff on this. I just want to make sure that if we have that information, that it's given to council so that we can use it in making a decision on whether we might want to support having a disparity study. And my assumption would be that doing a disparity study would probably be a budget item for next year. It's not budgeted now, so I don't know, either we're going to have to amend the budget if we want to get in ahead of it, or it would come as a budget item in the 22-23 budget. Is that a correct assumption?
In addition to doing a disparity study, we would also need to make sure that we are adequately staffed to be able to handle it. There are some pieces now, I think, that our financial services division has been carrying out. There are some additional, I think, just programmatic pieces that we could be engaged with in a different way if we were able to have the staff in place to do it. So from staff's perspective, we would look to be able to have the additional position as part of the budget that comes to you all, and the disparity study would need to be done at that time. If you all would want it done at a different schedule, then staff would need to know. But that's the path that we're on now.
I would raise for context our conversations in June 2021 as we were preparing for this current fiscal year's budget, in which I elevated the conversation of the disparity study being included in this coming budget. And it was asked by that group then that we hold off on it to consider it for an amendment during this year's budget. And I recall it because I was pretty adamant that we include it in the budget. The folks said at the time, we just felt like we needed more time for our DEI officer to do more learning, for the new city manager to get in place. There were a lot of things going on. And so I want to caution us to wait again until that budget process. Because during the last budget process, it was already asked to be waited until this point. I think what we've done is we've already asked a very highly qualified member of our staff who's well-versed in these conversations and has done a very thorough presentation to sort of consider this. And his recommendation is that we take action to at least consider this disparity study soon. And I think that, to the manager's point, if there are other considerations that need to be in there, sure, let's bring it forward. But I think the other big point for me is that we certainly make budget amendments. I think from time to time throughout a fiscal year. I think it's the nature of any governing group to make those amendments, especially for priorities that you think are important enough to support.
I have a question for Manager Logan Ford. So we'd have to hire another position to kind of undertake this study?
We would have to allocate another position to work in the financial services division to be able to manage this process.
And once the process is done, would that person just
No, that person would still need to be on board, because ideally, once a disparity study is completed, it's going to give you some additional pieces that you may need to add to your existing program. It's going to tell us where the gaps may be, and then you'll still have that person on board to help carry out that body of work.
Okay.
I think that there is, just from the work that the city's been doing, there's enough work in preparing for this to justify having a person on board if council wants to see us take more action in this area. The disparity study itself, we would have to go through the process of designing that proposal and get that actually out for consultants to be able to respond to. So in terms of us having a price that we would have tonight to do a budget amendment, then that wouldn't be available. But in terms of setting the process to go ahead and get that information for you, we could begin that work immediately.
And then I'm sure I probably missed the slide, but how much is the disparity study?
That, we won't know that until we
At
actually
all?
put it out on the.
Any idea at all?
We gave you a range of what some of the other
was
disparity
the range?
studies have
North of
cost
300.
Okay, okay.
Yeah,
in other cities, but we won't know what it would cost for High Point until we actually put our request for proposals out to consultants. They would respond, and then we would have a better idea of cost for this project.
One more question. Do you think that if the city of High Point did the disparity study and hired that person, that we would see an influx of minorities and women wanting to do business in High Point?
I think
Feeling more confident about applying?
I think anytime that you start to have a concentrated effort in an area, people start to, recognize that someone is actively seeking their engagement, there and available to ask questions, and that's the focus for that person. I think you get more interest and people come in, but until we figure out what our landscape looks like, I can't quantify what that number would be or what that interest would look like.
Okay. And then just for clarification, if anybody's listening, because I know that sometimes I hear people say, well, that means you're not going to hire the best person for the job. Having a disparity study has nothing to do with, the city would always hire the best person for the job.
Absolutely.
Okay.
The disparity study has nothing to do with that. Everyone's qualified to do the work.
Okay, perfect.
and we're still constrained too by certain state laws and contracting that require us to take the lowest bid on things, so there's, there are some legal constraints. Am I not?
The lowest
correct?
responsible.
Yeah, you know what I,
Right.
you know, I'm not gonna use the exact legal wording, but that's right. No,
People waiting.
I get it.
You
I
saw
get
both of us squirming in the
it.
chair.
We're both talking about the same thing.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Is there anything else on this topic?
Before we leave it, I think the last thing we heard from the manager was that council would have to, I guess, direct staff at this point if we do want to go ahead and see what those numbers and those figures and whatever information we need, and then decide at what point do we want this officially on an agenda for deliberation and consideration for action. But I believe that's the last point that we've not quite settled.
But this will require one additional employee hired for that process that would stay on the payroll after, am I correct?
It would. And the structure that staff is recommending at this point, just to be able to carry out the body of work, is where we would add it to our existing financial services versus creating these standalone models. I think until you get the results back from your disparity study to determine how robust of a program you may need, it would be a little bit premature for us to build out a large department or a separate area to handle the body of work. I think we have to get the disparity study information back in, let you all evaluate that, understand what landscape looks like for High Point, and then you start designing a larger program around that information.
What was the, okay, I know you brought it up before, Councilman Moore, that you were waiting for the results. When they did the study, is there like an average timetable that it takes?
It can take almost a year to do the disparity study.
Okay.
It's usually a 12-month process.
Well, what I think we ought to do then is have staff come back and bring us a proposal along with the information that I spoke about, so that we can determine whether this is something that we want to proceed with, and what the potential impact might be, and then we can certainly have a discussion at that point whether we want to proceed with it.
Well, this is Councilman Moore, and follow up a little bit on what Tasha just said, and her estimation of the time for the study. Mr. Biggs, if the numbers you presented in that slide, which I don't have memorized, I think were around 2016, 17 for Asheville and Charlotte. If that's the case, let's say they were 2 years, then they should have had some time to see what the end results of their numbers are 2 years later. Is that a correct assumption?
I think it's fair to say, Councilmember Moore, that we could follow up with them and see where they fall in terms of the deliverables from those studies. And whatever staff may find, we'll definitely make sure that gets back to council.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I think that'd be worthwhile as well to our decision-making process.
Do we have a date in mind, Mayor, for the?
I think that's up to staff on how quickly they think they can get that information together. Madam Manager, what do you think?
Let us try to begin the outreach to the other communities that were listed that have completed the disparity studies. We'll do at least 3 of those, and I can provide an update for you at our first meeting in February, which is just 2 weeks away, in terms of how that response is going, and give you all a better time frame if we can get that back to you.
Okay. All right. So then next on the agenda is the American Rescue Plan update.
Just over if you want.
Try.
Good afternoon. My name is Jerron Hollis. I'm the Managing Director for Communications and Public Engagement. American Rescue Plan, when all that information started coming out nationally, lots of questions from the public and from the community in individual cities about how those dollars could be spent and would be spent. In November of last year, Council agreed for staff to move forward with an outreach for our community. And I just want to take a few minutes and a few slides to kind of give a quick review of what we did with our partnership with P3 Consulting, and just a quick snapshot of some of the conversations and the 2 meetings that we had in November. So we had 2 meetings that we scheduled that included community members, residents, nonprofit leaders. Some of them are here today. And the question was, how will the $22 million, in their eyes, how should that funding be spent? The meetings were a part of a larger outreach project that included English and Spanish, online surveys. There was a survey that went live to the public on the 10th of November and remained open until the 3rd, and we have some of those results here in this presentation. There were also hard copies that were made available to residents that wanted to participate that way. So with a lot of assistance from staff, from our team, with guidance from the manager's office, and with a lot of help from the library and the museum, we set up 2 meetings. They were live stream meetings. One was at our public library, and then 2 days later we had one at our museum. Those were opportunities for dialogue that took about an hour and a half. In those meetings, the questions that you see before you were posed to the community, and I won't go in detail on all of them, it's there in front of you, but issues of negative economic impacts from COVID-19 that the city needs to address, places where the city should focus on water and sewer, general government services that should be a part of the city's focus, neighborhood improvement projects, and then additional questions regarding the funds and that allocation process that staff could answer at the time. So just a quick snapshot of some data that the consultant provided to us. 80% of our respondents were strong English speakers. 53% of the respondents were white or Caucasian, 22% Black or African American. There was a small percentage, 5%, that had an income reported of less than $12,000, 11% income of $118,000 or greater. So just lets you see kind of the spectrum of some of our participants. More info. The majority, 3/4, didn't have a disability. We had a small group of respondents that identified as a woman. And as far as age, 36%, at least 45 years old or older, 23% were in that 18 to 44 age category. So what did people say? What was some of the feedback? And as you can see there were questions and ideas about homelessness, food insecurity, litter, the wealth gap, affordable health care, suggestions about mental health outreach. As far as housing issues, affordable options being available, assistance for evictions, blight, and then suggestions about our process as it involves the demolition of homes and repair and upgrade of those homes. Employment issues, access to jobs through transit, staffing shortages, childcare access, job training, return to work initiatives, some discussion about infrastructure, economic development, water quality, street, sidewalk, and overall maintenance, and then some aesthetics even to burying power lines. From an economic development standpoint, there were, to summarize some of the information, investing in quality hotels and motels, support for small and women-owned and minority-owned businesses, marketing our existing amenities and programs that are available, education issues, caregiver shortages, education for immigrant adults, affordable quality child care, and then some suggestions as far as programming and broadband access for virtual learning. And as we get into the home stretch here, community programs, nonprofit issues, lack of funding for certain programs, lack of venues or facilities. There was some discussion by some of in-person performances and events, how COVID has impacted that. From a suggestion standpoint, program offerings for youth activities and violence prevention. There were existing city facilities like Oak Hollow Lake and how we could use improvements there for events like the Coltrane Festival. And in all, we got a snapshot of some of the ideas. We tried to educate people. We tried to give them the resources. One of the things that we were up against, a lot of the expectations based on what other communities were doing was what specifically the city would do to engage those stakeholders in getting their hands on those funds. So as a follow-up, and I think staff will talk more about that, is now that we have this money or getting this money, how are we going to use it, and how can the participants, many in the survey, how can they figure out how they can apply, get their hands on it? So those were some of the lead-ups. We tried to also give information to people about understanding the difference in what services we provide as a city versus what other entities of government do. And so all in all, we had, I think, solid turnout and feedback. The data, the raw data from the surveys we do have available. They did give that to us. And that's all I had. Mr. Mayor, if there are any questions, I'd be glad to answer those if I can.
Well, one question I have, one thing I didn't see in here was anything about broadband. Broadband access was, did I just miss it?
There was on the bottom of the slide, ensuring broadband access to virtual learning. That was one. I was trying to summarize, but my apologies if I didn't mention that bullet.
There it is. Okay.
Yes, so there was some discussion about broadband that came up in summary.
Were there any, I mean, you've kind of listed what were in here, but were there any trends? I mean, as far as the percentage of people that brought up certain, certain proposals? I mean, were there any clear winners, I guess,
well,
in the suggestions?
And without putting a thumb on the scale, I think what we did here is we tried to synthesize and summarize some of those individuals. So as you see these individual categories, for example, lack of funding or some of these specifics, we try to give a snapshot of what they were talking about, but there are trends listed here. We didn't, we had more data, but we tried to put it in a way that we could summarize it shortly. But I think with this information combined with direction that will come from staff about obligations, I think the idea here was to give council a snapshot of what was in front of you, and then with additional dialogue, determine what the next steps look like. But I think from a theme, I think there is, from this data and from the surveys, there is a general consensus that there are things in the community that people feel strongly about, that they want to see those dollars move toward. And then it's just a matter of how much, where, and when. But I think it's an education process, and I think that one of the important things that will be necessary going forward will be to try to establish the guardrails, guidelines, set expectations so that the people that have this raw information and have these questions, they understand what to expect in the process going forward. And I think the manager and other staff will kind of talk about that at some point in the future. And I'll hand it off.
When we went through this, we tried to identify if there were programs or areas where either we heard repeatedly, this is where you need to focus the attention. That did not come out of our community meetings. I think there were a number of different priorities that were listed in each meeting. A lot of them were focused around supporting existing work that many of our nonprofits are doing in the community. There were a lot of conversations around housing needs at various different levels. The infrastructure piece is where that came up most often, so that's why we were putting these in broad categories. I think for us as a council, we'll need to have some conversations with you all around where is that area of focus. The kind of the big buckets that you see here around employment, infrastructure, that's where we grouped the responses that we got from the public. Those might be broad categories that you all could use to structure how people apply for funds under these specific categories, if that's the route that we choose to take. There's kind of a part 2 of this presentation. I want to make sure that we brought both of these on the same night, because we have the feedback that we got from community meetings, but there's also a conversation around how these funds can be used to support capital projects that were deferred as part of the city's budget when it was passed in June. Several of those projects were deferred. We want to have conversations to figure out which pieces could be funded with ARPA funds, and we're also prepared to share with you that conversation. And I feel like you all need to hear both sides of that before we develop what our strategy will be moving forward. Because if we choose to fund those capital projects that were deferred as part of the budget with these federal dollars, that's going to limit the amount of money that we have available to support some of these community initiatives.
Just before we move off of the community side, I guess for me it's going to be about, like, you spoke of educating the population or whoever participated. I guess in the past, it's not everybody in the public understands that there's restrictions with dollars allocated from federal levels. How well was that received? Because I got a feeling once we move a little farther into this and this goes out to the public, we will be getting questions on, why I didn't get it, and just I want to see how well they received to understand that this just isn't money given away to whatever. It has to come with restrictions.
I can respond to that, Councilman Williams. We didn't go into detail of explaining what restrictions might be associated with the funds. At the time that we were doing the community meetings, we hadn't received our final guidance yet, so we weren't in a position to be able to tell individuals that were there, or even agencies at that point, what the requirements would be in order to spend the money. We have that guidance now, and as staff and working with school government, we're kind of delving into that. So I think that could be the next phase of conversations and education in our community is, what does it mean if you were able to receive these dollars? How are they used? The time frame associated with spending, and also the reporting that's associated with spending those funds as well.
Thank you.
I have one question real quick. Do we have a number of projects and proposals that have been submitted to the city?
We have interest from a number of agencies.
Okay.
And we have projects that they would like for us to invest in.
Okay.
But we have not put out a process and made it available to everyone to know what that is, to be able to access these dollars. There are some communities that have put out application processes to certain community groups. In some cases, they were overwhelmed with applications, and clearly, the request clearly exceed the amount of funding that's available. We have not done that here until we figure out, one, how much money do we have available, so I think it's important for us to put that number out there of what's available, and then we have to have some conversations around where do we want to focus our dollars? Do we want to have priority areas where we focus in certain areas, or do we want to just open it up and see what kind of proposals we get in, and then as a body evaluate once they're received? So I think there are kind of two different paths that we could take on this, but we have not laid out a path yet until we first got the community input, then decide what's available. Then we'll decide on the process.
Perfect. Thank you.
Ron, how many people participated? Because I watched all these meetings, and there was like a dozen people at each one of them, so.
Yeah, I think in person, and I thought we had that on one of the slides, but
I may have missed it.
I think it is, and maybe we cut that out. Each of these had between 12 and 15 people attending at these facilities. Keeping in mind that, you know, with a lot of other competing events and other things, which we thought it was a good turnout, but, you know, with the surveys, with the streaming, that would go beyond those numbers that were there. But we can pull some more data on that if you want to know more about numbers.
I'm just curious as, you know, if this is an accurate depiction of what the city of High Point as a whole would actually want to do with these funds based on 12, 15 people. It's not a good poll. So for us to get a better idea as a council how to appropriate, I mean, it would need to be, in my opinion, a broader study. But
How many responded to the survey?
The survey numbers that we had, I think from a response standpoint, we had, I think, a little under 100, I believe, Ryan. But we'll get that number, but it was the numbers that were attending the events, plus the people that saw it, plus the survey. The goal was to try to get as many platforms and reach as many people as possible with this kind of targeted information. The number of people on the respondents on the surveys is in some of the raw data, but we'll get that to you ASAP.
And just to kind of touch point on this, when Guilford County did the same thing, when they had the meeting here in council chambers here in High Point, we had the highest numbers of one of those meetings. So that gives you an idea, you know, even though they may not show here, but and the choice was put out to the population, notified, and they think, I don't remember, they had like a double-digit amount of meetings, but the highest one was right in this chamber. So to be fair is what I'm saying. Yeah. You know, it's given to the public to see it and understand it. And if the only thing I know to do, if you tell someone there's free money, they don't show up, it's ask for free food. So other than that, if you don't get that kind of response, you're going to get what you get. And I think that's the work has been put in.
And these meetings happened after that Guilford County meeting, which was here in council chamber. So yes, there were meetings that Guilford County held as well before this.
A couple of things.
Yes.
I'm sure COVID affects everybody differently, but I'm sure it affected the numbers that showed up to your meeting. Thanks for your efforts and all of this. When you do get the survey information on what you think was returned, find out how many were, you probably already know, but bring back what was sent out too. And can you go back to slide number 2 real quick?
Number 2, yeah, sure.
One more.
My 2.
Yeah, it may have been my 2. Go again. I'm just trying to get to some numbers here real quick.
This just in 137 respondents to the survey, 137.
Out of how many sent?
They weren't sent. It was
They weren't
available-
sent,
it
they
was
were
available-
broad blasted.
It was available online.
Okay.
It was a broad, a blasting.
All right, go to the next one, please. One more.
Okay.
Let me get to the breakdown here.
Okay.
Okay, so of the respondents, you obviously asked about color and male, female, that kind of thing. But if you take that percentage of 53 and then 22, how does that break down against the number of our city? What's our current city breakdown on percentage? Anybody know that? I don't.
African Americans 35, whites 55 to 60, and then there's a 9%.
Okay.
Somewhere within that. Don't quote me on those numbers.
Okay.
That's-
And then the final thing for Manager Ford, the final guidance is in from the Federal Treasury, correct?
It is,
And how many pages is that?
Eric. How many volumes?
Volumes or pages?
Pages.
Okay, all right, okay.
One more, and, okay, but at the end of the day, it's the city staff and management that can really kind of see the needs of the city with this information and make the best recommendations for the city.
And we would bring that and do that, thinking about what the strategic goals that the council has
Perfect.
set as part of your plan.
Yeah.
And that's the same lens that we used in developing these buckets of how we group the responses.
Perfect, okay.
And Madam Manager, you mentioned that you all have a presentation regarding deferred budget items, right?
We do, and we'll get ready to present that next, so you all can see those items that were deferred.
And then you said after that, maybe we get to talk a little bit about strategy.
We need to have some conversations around strategy once you see both pieces.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, next on the agenda, we have a closed session for,
That's the budget piece.
Oh.
We have to do the budget piece of the American Rescue Plan.
we have to do the budget piece.
This is just another presentation.
Oh.
Steve is gonna give.
Okay, my fault. I thought we were done. Well, we need to move quickly so we can get this closed session done in the next 24 minutes. So,
Yes, thank you. Just a few slides kind of highlighting and a refresher of the items that were deferred as part of the budget that would be a potential recommendation to be funded with our American Rescue Plan funds. This is just a summary of the list. The next few slides kind of go into a little bit more detail, but it's mostly departmental equipment, vehicles and other stock, and then general capital projects. And just a reminder, the City of High Point's allocation, total allocation of American Rescue Plan funds will be approximately $22.7 million. This list totals slightly over $5.5 million. So if this entire list was allocated using these funds, that would still leave about $17.1 million for other eligible projects. These all would fall under the revenue loss category, which is for any projects that meet a government service. Our initial estimates on revenue loss was up to $12.8 million. The final rule, which has been out for a few weeks, did have some slight changes to how that revenue loss amount can be calculated. So staff are still going through that to see if that total amount available could increase. But using that up to $12.8 million, if this entire list were allocated using revenue loss dollars, that would still leave about $7.2 million in that category, in addition to the other eligible ARP categories. So just running through some of the project details, vehicles and other rolling stock, almost $2 million, 1.9 total, and this is some sedans and trucks, mainly in the engineering and parks and recreation departments, some fire vehicles. This includes one engine apparatus, then also a tractor, a brush truck, just kind of to catch up the fire department with their replacement schedule, and then also a slope mower, and that's for the public services department. Several items for IT equipment, and these would help with the city's network monitoring, data center backup, and data services. Also some transportation, kind of one-time operating equipment, totaling $50,000. This includes an air compressor, some signs, aero boards, and kind of message boards that you see kind of out about when there are road closures or detours and things of that nature. Getting into more of the kind of deferred capital items, parking improvements totaling $150,000, and these would be some deferred maintenance at the hotel deck as well as the commerce deck. Some fire projects, $325,000. The majority of this is for station upgrades to station headquarters, and also some storage over at the fire training facility. Parks and recreation projects totaling slightly over $871,000, and this is a good amount of different kind of areas for parks and recreation: playground equipment, outdoor court improvements, parking lot resurfacing, recreation center improvements, and those were to the Southside, Moorhead, and Oakview recreation centers, and also adding some additional restrooms at several parks. Some improvements to the stadium. That last bullet, a stadium reserve. This would allow for routine maintenance at the stadium as it comes up on an annual basis, and also some specific projects, hydraulic lift and in replacement of the batter's eye. Moving on, planning projects, just improvements to the GIS ortho imagery project, as well as an investment in the 2040 comprehensive plan. Some transportation projects, and these include local matches for our NCDOT funded projects, improvements at railroad crossings, interchanges, sidewalks, greenways, upgrades to the signal system, as well as improvements to the Mendenhall terminal. Upgrades for public services. This includes some cemetery paving and mausoleum improvements at the Oakwood Cemetery, as well as any local match for NCDOT bridge projects. And the last set of details, other projects, and these kind of just didn't fit into one kind of summary department category. Some safety improvements to our facilities, and those needs are studied on a routine basis. Added electronic lockers for the library at the Deep River Recreation Center, and also a replacement of the basement sewer lines at the High Point Theater. And lastly, the capital improvement plan included the Samet Drive Extension project. We know that engineering and design has been approved by council, and so this would just reimburse the city for the cost of that. I'm happy to answer any questions about any of the projects.
Madam Manager, seeing this list, and I hate to ask it because I know it's pretty hard, it's like asking you to pick your favorite child, but if we had to prioritize this list, let's just say it's $5.5 million, but we want to prioritize it, so that way when we get into our strategy conversations, we can, we can look and see, maybe we decide we don't want to do 5.5, maybe we want to do 4.75, but at least we know that based on what the priorities are. Is there a way for this list to maybe be prioritized?
We can prioritize the list.
Just to have that, okay.
We can do that, bring that back. And we can schedule a conversation for a future work session where we have the prioritized list of the capital projects. And then also, now that you all have seen what the community feedback was, and then we can decide on a process. Steve, that's all we have for this presentation.
Okay. Thank you. All right, so now we're going to do a closed session for purposes of economic development. And so I will need a motion to go into closed session.
So move. Second.
Okay, there's a motion and a second for council to go into closed session for purposes of economic development. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Is there anyone opposed? That motion passes, so we're now in closed session. As soon as the room gets cleared and the feed is disconnected.